Hello, everyone. My name is Ike Dawson, and this is Unpacking the Faith. And recently, I was in a situation where someone was making implications about Catholic Church teaching that were untrue. So, in this video, what I would like to do is offer a response to those implications and actually shed light on the truth of what the Catholic Church teaches on these doctrines. But before I get into that, just want to remind you, please be sure to like and subscribe. And those of you who have been liking and those of you who have subscribed, I greatly appreciate it. And your continued support for this channel would be greatly appreciated as well. So as I said, I was recently in a situation where someone was making some implications about Catholic Church teaching that were false. And I was in such a position where I couldn't really offer a rebuttal. And I'm used to this. I've been in many situations where people have made claims about Catholic teaching, Catholic doctrine that are not true. And usually when people do this, it's out of ignorance. They don't really understand the Catholic teaching, or they've just never even really done the research to see what the Catholic Church is taught. A lot of times they go from hearsay and things like that. So what I want to do is take a look at these topics, these areas, and see what the Catholic Church actually teaches on these. So there were two areas in which these implications were made. One was in the area of purgatory, and one was in the area of eternal salvation and Jesus' role in that. So we'll start with purgatory and the implications kind of made there. Now, again, I don't know if the person meant to imply these things, but this was certainly the message that seemed to come across from these implications. All right, so it's always important to keep that in mind. So the person went on talking about how where you spend your eternity, whether in heaven or in hell, is based solely on how you have lived in this life on this earth before you die. Now, the Catholic Church 100% agrees with that. Catholic teaching is that where you spend eternity is based on how you have lived in this life. And of course, your relationship to Christ and being born again and things of that nature. Now, where things seem to go off the rails is, and this statement was not quite as egregious as this implication was not quite as egregious as the second implication that was made, which we'll get to later. This one kind of got a little muddy and murky here. But the next thing that was said was, once you die, no one can pray your way into heaven, or something along those lines. And no one can put money to the Catholic Church to get you out of purgatory and into heaven. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with the basics of Catholic teaching, you can probably see where this is starting to get unhinged here. The implication seems to be that the Catholic Church teaches that once a person has died, even if they have died outside of grace, so they have lived in such a way where their destiny would be hell, you can pray that soul into heaven. In other words, you can pray an eternally damned soul into heaven. And the second implication here, or the second statement here, seems to suggest that Catholic teaching is that you can buy a soul out of purgatory. If you put enough money to the church, then that soul can get out of purgatory and go to heaven. And in the grander context of this, it seems almost as if purgatory, or the implication here is that purgatory is a place for people who are not in a state of grace. Now, again, I'm not 100% sure if this is all what the person was trying to convey, but this seemed to be the message that came across. So I want to address those issues first. So, first of all, the Catholic Church does not teach that you can buy a soul out of purgatory. Okay? We'll come back to what purgatory is in a second, but I want to make that abundantly clear. While there have been abuses in the church by individual people in which the Catholic Church has addressed, the Catholic Church has never taught that you can buy someone's way out of purgatory. So that would just be false. Now, as far as the Catholic Church teaching that you can pray a soul who is apparently not saved into heaven, the Catholic Church doesn't teach that either. The Catholic Church fully agrees that once a person has died, that's it. They're facing judgment. So the Catholic Church does not teach that if I know someone and I know that they died outside of grace, I can pray for their salvation and God will take a soul who does not belong in heaven and allow them to be in heaven. If someone thinks that's what the Catholic Church teaches, that's just wrong. The Catholic Church does not teach that. So let's get to purgatory. And I think some of the confusion over this is over what purgatory actually is. So the Catholic Church teaches that once a soul has departed from the body and goes to the Lord for judgment, i.e. they've died, that soul has one or two states that they can be in. State of grace, state outside of grace. If a person is in a state of grace, they are guaranteed heaven. There's nothing that can happen to that soul that would keep them from going to heaven. If a person or if a soul is outside of the state of grace, then that soul is going to hell. And there is nothing that can be done to make that soul in a state of grace. That soul is going to hell. So where does purgatory come in? Well, most of us would agree that even when saved people die, or many saved people, when they die, they still died with some sinful tendencies. So even though the person was saved, we would not say that at the time of their death they were perfect, that they were just completely sinless and were completely without any sinful tendencies or habits. Now, the problem with that is no sin can enter into heaven. Book of Revelations tells us that. So, Book of Revelation tells us that. So, what happens to that soul who has attachments to sin, sinful tendencies, but has died in a state of grace? They have not sinned in such a way where they have turned away from the Lord. Well, that soul has to be purged of its sinful attachments and tendencies so that it can enter into heaven. That process by which God takes that saved soul and purges the last remaining tendencies to sin and attachments to sin so that it can enter into heaven is called purgatory. That is the process through which God gives the final sanctification of that soul. So, when a person is born again, when they are saved, God begins a lifelong process of sanctifying or purifying that soul to make it more and more like Jesus so that that soul can enter into heaven. Well, oftentimes we die before that sanctification process has fully done its job. So God continues that sanctification process after our death, provided we died in a state of grace. That sanctification process after death is what we call purgatory. Now, some people might push back against this by saying that this is incompatible with Jesus' death on the cross, but it's actually not. If Jesus doesn't win salvation for us on Calvary, then you would not go to purgatory if you had sinful attachments. You would go to hell. Purgatory is a grace that was won by Jesus on the cross. Now, some people might also say, well, what about in the Bible where it says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? How can there be purgatory then after death? Well, there's two things I would say to that. Number one, you can still have purgatory and it be true that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. After you die, your soul is going to go to the Lord for judgment. And it could be at that point that Jesus says, okay, you have to go through this purgation, or perhaps you go through this purgation right there in front of Jesus. You're still present with the Lord. So that doesn't really negate purgatory. Also, nowhere in the Bible does it actually say to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. You've heard many people say that, but that's just not in Scripture. What people are actually doing when they say that is they are misquoting 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, where it says, I would rather be absent from the body and be present with the Lord. But that's not the same thing as saying to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I could be at work and I would rather be absent from work and at home barbecuing. That does not mean to be absent from work is to be at home barbecuing. I could be absent from work and stuck in gridlock traffic. So those are not the same thing. So when people actually make that statement, they're actually misquoting 2 Corinthians. So purgatory is definitely well within the scope of Jesus' sacrifice, and we would have to go as far as to say that purgatory is a grace that was won by Jesus' sacrifice. Now, purgatory is not a place for people who are not good enough to go to heaven and not bad enough to go to hell. Some people think purgatory is that. Purgatory is also not a second chance. You have to already have died in a state of grace to go through purgatory. If you are not in a state of grace at the time of your death, you will go through hell. Remember, purgatory is just the process through which God takes a saved soul and prepares it to enter into heaven. So it's not for a place for unsaved people. It is only, or a process for unsaved people. It is a process for saved people. The church also does not necessarily teach that purgatory is a place. There are some Christians in history who thought of purgatory as a place, and there were some who thought purgatory could last hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the church does not teach that. While that could be true, purgatory could be an instantaneous thing. It's possible that when a person dies and they see Jesus face to face, that encounter is so overwhelming that it detaches the soul from any remaining attachments to sin and tendencies to sin. That would still be purgatory. So it's important to understand purgatory is just simply this process through which God puts the soul through to prepare it for heaven. So hopefully that is more clear about what purgatory is. Why do Catholics pray for the souls that are in purgatory? Well, the reason Catholics pray for the souls that are going through purgatory is because purgatory is most likely a process that involves some suffering. Since our sanctification in this life involves suffering, God says that he chastens those he loves. He gives us corrective punishment to make us more and more like his son, Jesus. If that process continues after our death, if that process is not completed at the time of our death, then it would stand to reason that there would continue to be perhaps some suffering involved. Again, this is before the soul enters into heaven, because there's no suffering in heaven. And because of that, we pray for God's comfort for those souls. Now, it is important to remember that if no one prays for you, if you end up in purgatory and no one prays for you, no one even knew you existed, you are still guaranteed to go to heaven. Every soul that goes through purgation, that goes through purgatory, is guaranteed heaven. If you are going through purgatory, that means you died saved, and you died saved based on your life in this life, how you lived on this earth. So hopefully that's very clear. Just a little recap. The Catholic Church does not teach that you can buy a soul out of purgatory, or that you can give enough money to the church to get a soul out of purgatory and save them and get them into heaven. The Catholic Church does not teach that purgatory is a place for anyone except saved souls who God is preparing for heaven. So that's important to remember. And the Catholic Church does not teach that you can pray a soul out of a state of damnation or out of a state of being destined for hell into a state of salvation or a state of grace. The Catholic Church does not teach that. So, I just want to be clear about that. So hopefully people understand some of these topics, especially when it gets to purgatory, can be kind of confusing. But there are actual passages in the Bible that do support purgatory. Some people claim that purgatory is unbiblical, but there are passages that seem to point to purgatory. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it say the word purgatory, just like nowhere in the Bible does it say the word Trinity or Sunday school, or nowhere in the Bible does it say go to church every Sunday. And nowhere in the Bible does it even say that everything about the faith must be found in the Bible. In fact, there are passages that seem to suggest that that's not necessarily the case. So it would be unfair to say that purgatory is unbiblical because the word purgatory is not found in the Bible. But there are places, like for example in Luke chapter 12, where it does seem to be talking about purgatory, where in the parable in Luke chapter 12, Jesus talks about a master who goes on a journey and leaves servants in charge, and some of those servants do the will of the Father and are put in charge, that do the will of the master while the master is gone, and are put in charge of the household, representing heaven. There are other servants who got drunk and beat their fellow servants and were cut in half, which represents hell. And most people who read the Bible agree that this is what this is talking about. But Jesus gives two other outcomes, being beaten with stripes, that seem to point to corrective punishment after death, not meant to be eternal punishment. And it can't be talking about heaven because there is no punishment in heaven. This does seem to be a reference to purgatory. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go real deep into this or the other passages in the Bible that do seem to point to purgatory. I can do a later video addressing purgatory in more detail. But I just wanted to bring up that there are passages in the Bible that do seem to point to purgatory. So to say it's unbiblical would be untrue. You might interpret it a different way, but there are passages that do support purgatory in the Bible. Now, the second implication that was made was more egregious. And I would go as far as to say this one might tantamount to slander. So the second statement was something along the lines of, if you want to be saved, Jesus is the only way, which Catholics would agree with. Now, what followed, again, is where things got off the rail. The person said, I don't want to make any of my Muslim friends uncomfortable. And then went on to say, any of my Catholic folk, I don't mean to make you mad or something like that. And that's a very bizarre statement because the implication is that, like Muslims, Catholics don't believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation. Now, if you think that the Catholic Church teaches that there is another way to salvation other than through Jesus, then you really don't know enough about the Catholic Church to give a critique on it. The Catholic Church does believe that the only way to the Father is through the Son. The only way to salvation is through Jesus. Now, to be fair, I will say the Catholic Church, people in the church, are not always great at communicating what the Catholic Church actually teaches. And over the years, there's been a lot of confusion about certain statements that have been made from the Catholic Church that can definitely cause people some confusion. But a simple Google search, a little bit of research on your own, will help you to arrive at the answer to the question of whether or not Catholics believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation. This is actually something very clearly laid out in Catholic doctrine. And one place that we actually see this is in the actual Catholic catechism. So if you've never seen the Catechism of the Catholic Church, this is what it is. It's a book that has the church doctrine in it, and it talks about different things related to the Catholic faith. So there is a passage in the Catechism, actually paragraph 480, where it talks about Jesus in his role in salvation. So this is paragraph 480 in the Catholic Catechism. Okay? It says, Jesus Christ is true God and true man, in the unity of his divine person. For this reason, he is the one and only mediator between God and man. So, The Catechism of the Catholic Church says, in plain English, that Jesus Christ is the one and only mediator between God and man. Not that he is one of several mediators between God and man. Not that he is an option as a mediator between God and man. The Catholic Church teaches that Jesus Christ is the one and only mediator between God and man. Now, Muslims don't believe this. That's true. Jewish people don't believe this. That's true. But to say Catholics don't believe this, that's kind of slanderous. The Catholic Church clearly believes this and clearly teaches this. And again, just a little research would show you that the church teaches this. Also, if you go to actual Catholic Mass, you will see at every Sunday Mass, every single one, you see Catholics get up and recite the creed. In the creed, it says that for us men and for our salvation, he, meaning Jesus, came down from heaven. Now, it doesn't say for us men and for our salvation that Mary came down from heaven. Because you'll hear some people that say, you guys believe Mary saved you. No, we don't. Because we don't say for us men and for our salvation, Mary came down from heaven. We don't say for us men and for our salvation, the saints came down from heaven. We don't say for us men and for our salvation in John the Baptist or Augustine or anybody else came down from heaven. We say Jesus came down from heaven for us men and for our salvation. We don't say Mary is the one and only mediator between God and man. We don't say the saints are the only mediators between God and man. We don't say Jesus, Mary, and the saints are the only mediators between God and man. The Catholic Church in the Catechism says that there is one and only mediator between God and man, and that is Jesus. If Jesus is the one and only mediator between God and man, he is the one and only Savior, the only cause of salvation, the only way to the Father. So to say that Catholics believe that there is another way to the Father other than through Jesus is slanderous. And to put us in the same category as Muslims in this regard. Because Muslims will straight up tell you, yeah, we do not believe that Jesus is the one and only way to the Father, that he is the one and only mediator, that God rose him from the dead and he is seated at the right hand of the Father. Muslims would agree with that. But to say that Catholics, like Muslims, believe that there is another way to the Father other than through Jesus is that is slanderous. So even if you thought that was true, you need to do the research before you make that claim against the church. Now, again, if you go to Mass, if you are involved in any type of Catholic activities, you will clearly see that that is not what Catholics believe. And this is why I would say that was the more egregious implication. So, hopefully I cleared both of these things up. I will probably do another video later on purgatory and maybe another video maybe in more depth outlining what the Catholic Church teaches about how a person is saved and how they end up in heaven. Though I've covered a decent amount of it in this video, I'll probably make another one that's a little bit more detailed. But remember, if you are dealing with a group of people and they seem to believe something that is fantastic or a little too outrageous, do the research. See, in fact, if that is what they believe. One of the problems today is there's a lot of misinformation getting put out there, and people hear this and they just run with it without checking to see if it is the truth. Always do the research and see if it's the truth. Now, if you actually can articulate the correct understanding of purgatory, and if you can articulate the correct understanding of Catholic doctrine when it comes to salvation or any topic, and you still say, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in Catholic doctrine. That's your right to do that. What you don't get to do, though, is misrepresent what the Catholic Church teaches and then say, I don't believe in that. That would be more dishonest, okay? So always, whenever you're having these types of discussions, always find out what they actually believe first, and then you can have a debate or a discourse from that. So we don't want people to be deceived about what groups believe. We want people to have the truth about what groups believe, and then you can make your decision from there. So hopefully this has been informative and have helped you out. So again, this is Ike Dawson, and this is Unpacking the Faith, and hopefully I will see you next time. Thank you.